Wyoming Territory, 1885. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the porch of the Callahan Ranch as Matthew Callahan rocked slowly in his chair, the weathered wood creaking beneath him like the joints in his aging body. At 67, his face had become a map of the West itself, deep lines carved by sun and wind, eyes still sharp but softened by the wisdom that only comes from a life fully lived. His son James sat beside him, tall and lean at 25, preparing to leave for Denver in the morning to begin his studies in law. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the pines. "Before you go," Matthew said, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age, "there's a story you should hear about how I met your mother, about justice and what it really means." James turned, curiosity lighting his eyes. He had heard fragments over the years, whispered conversations between his parents, but never the full account. Matthew's mind drifted back 20 years to 1865, when the nation was healing from the wounds of war, and he was healing from wounds much deeper and more personal. "It began with a scream," he said quietly, "the kind that changes everything." Wyoming Territory, 1865. Matthew Callahan brought the hammer down hard on the glowing iron, each strike precise and purposeful. At 47, he was still a powerful man, his frame hardened by war and wilderness. The blacksmith forge behind his isolated ranch sat a good 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, exactly how he preferred it. The April sun beat down as Matthew shaped the horseshoe with practiced movements. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cool mountain air. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and scarred from both battle and his trade. A former captain in the Union Army, he had found peace in the rhythmic work of metal and fire after the horrors of Gettysburg and the personal tragedy that had driven him west. The sound that interrupted his work wasn't the usual noise of the wilderness. It came faintly at first, carried on the wind, a human sound, ragged and desperate. Matthew paused, hammer suspended mid-swing, listening intently. When it came again, there was no mistaking the agonized cry. He plunged the horseshoe into the water barrel, sending up a cloud of steam, then reached for the Colt Navy revolver that never left his workbench. The weapon slid into his holster with familiar weight as he strode toward his horse. The cry led him south across the stream that marked his property line and into a stand of cottonwoods. As he pushed through the undergrowth, the noon sun fragmented through the leaves overhead, creating a dappled pattern that briefly disoriented him. When his vision adjusted, the sight before him stopped him cold. A young woman hung suspended upside down between 2 wooden stakes driven into the hard earth. Her arms were stretched out and bound with rope, her long black hair brushing the ground beneath her. Blood had soaked through her deerskin dress and dripped onto the earth below, forming a dark stain in the dust. Matthew dismounted quickly, approaching with caution born from years in hostile territory. The woman was Native American, likely Lakota from her dress and the patterns woven into her clothing. Her eyes were closed, face swollen from being inverted for what appeared to be many hours. But what made Matthew's blood run cold was the word carved into her chest. The crude letters still seeping blood. Thief. The sight triggered a memory so vivid it nearly brought him to his knees. His wife Elizabeth and their daughter Hannah, found in similar circumstances outside their Boston home 7 years earlier. The same method, the same cruelty. With practiced precision, Matthew cut her down, supporting her body as the ropes gave way. She was light in his arms, but still breathing, shallow, rapid breaths that spoke of determination even in unconsciousness. He laid her gently on the ground, checking her pulse and assessing her wounds with the skill of a man who had tended too many battlefield injuries. "You're safe now," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. "I've got you." He lifted her carefully onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her limp form against his chest as he rode back to his ranch. Inside his cabin, he cleared the table with one sweep of his arm, laying her down and working quickly to clean and treat her wounds. Matthew retrieved his medical kit, a relic from his military service. The instruments inside were well maintained: scalpels, forceps, and suturing needles, alongside bottles of alcohol and packets of herbs. He cut away the blood-soaked dress around her wounds, cleansing them with whiskey and working with the steady hands of a man accustomed to crisis. The carving was superficial, meant to mark rather than kill. The greater danger came from exposure and blood loss. As he worked, his mind traveled back to that night in Boston, 1858, when he'd returned home from his law office to find his family murdered, punishment for his investigation into a prominent businessman's dealings with slave traders. After their deaths, he had abandoned his legal practice, joined the Union Army, and tried to lose himself in the chaos of war. When peace came, he had continued west, seeking isolation and anonymity in the Wyoming Territory. Now, tending to this wounded stranger, Matthew felt something stir within him, something he had thought long dead, a sense of purpose, a desire for justice that had once defined his existence. The woman stirred slightly as he finished bandaging her wounds. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes as dark as obsidian. For a moment, they locked onto Matthew with a fierce intensity that belied her weakened state. Then consciousness slipped away again, her features relaxing into the temporary peace of oblivion. Night fell as Matthew kept vigil beside his unexpected guest. He built up the fire in the stone hearth, filling the cabin with warmth and dancing shadows. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves and carrying the promise of rain. In the flickering light, Matthew opened a weathered trunk beneath his bed. Inside lay his Union Army uniform, the captain's bars still gleaming despite the years. Beside it rested a leather-bound journal filled with his neat handwriting, a record of his search for the men who had murdered his family, a search that had yielded only dead ends and heartache. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small daguerreotype of Elizabeth and Hannah, their faces forever frozen in happiness, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Matthew touched it briefly, then carefully rewrapped it and returned it to its resting place. When he turned back to his patient, he found her eyes open, watching him with a mixture of fear and defiance. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds. "Easy," Matthew said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe here." The woman's gaze darted around the cabin, taking in her surroundings with the wariness of a cornered animal. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but clear, her English fluent though accented. "Who are you?" "Matthew Callahan. This is my ranch. I found you in the woods south of here." She attempted to rise again, determination evident in every line of her body. "I must go." Matthew shook his head. "Not yet. You've lost blood. Those wounds need time to heal." Her dark eyes narrowed, assessing him. "Why help me? I am Lakota." The question hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. In this territory, relations between settlers and Native Americans were complex at best, hostile at worst. Many would have ridden past her, or worse, finished what her attackers had begun. "I help because you needed helping," Matthew answered simply. "Your being Lakota has nothing to do with it." A flash of surprise crossed her features before the mask of caution returned. She relaxed slightly against the pillow, seeming to accept that she lacked the strength to leave. "I am Sarah Blackfeather," she said finally, "daughter of Chief Gray Wolf." The name meant nothing to Matthew, who had deliberately isolated himself from the affairs of both settlers and natives since arriving in the territory. His ignorance must have shown on his face. "You do not know my father," Sarah continued, her voice strengthening. "He signed a treaty with your government for our lands, a fair treaty, but now men say we have no rights to our sacred grounds." She paused, pain clouding her features momentarily. "They took our papers, the proof of our agreement. Then they said we stole from them." Matthew offered her water, which she accepted cautiously. "Who did this to you, Sarah?" Her jaw tightened, eyes flashing with remembered horror and rage. "Hamilton brothers, Victor and Ethan. They own the mining company. They came to our camp while men were hunting. Said I stole silver from their office." She looked down at her bandaged chest, where the word thief was now hidden beneath clean linen. "They did this to make an example. Said any Lakota found on their land would meet the same fate." Matthew's expression remained neutral, but inside a cold fury was building. The details were different, but the methods were familiar. Too familiar to be coincidence. "These Hamilton brothers," he said carefully. "Where would I find them?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "You seek them? Well," Matthew considered his answer carefully. "Let's just say this isn't the first time I've seen their handiwork." Thunder rumbled in the distance as the promised storm approached. Rain began to patter against the cabin roof, a gentle counterpoint to the tension within. They own Redemption Springs, Sarah said, though. The town, the mines, everything. Victor is the older one. Gray hair, beard, scar above his eye. She hesitated. Ethan is younger, quieter, but just as dangerous. Matthew nodded, absorbing the information. Rest now, we'll talk more in the morning. Sarah watched him warily for a moment longer before exhaustion claimed her once again. As she slept, Matthew sat by the fire, staring into the flames as memories and possibilities warred within him. For 7 years, he had hidden from the world, nursing his grief and guilt. Now fate had delivered to his doorstep a victim of what appeared to be the same men who had destroyed his family. The coincidence seemed too great to ignore. Outside, the storm grew in intensity, wind howling around the cabin like restless spirits. Matthew cleaned his revolver by the firelight, each movement practiced and precise. He had sworn never to return to his old life, never again to fight battles that couldn't be won. But as the night deepened, he felt the stirrings of something long dormant within him. Purpose. Morning brought clear skies and a decision. After checking Sarah's wounds and leaving her with food, water, and his spare revolver within reach, Matthew saddled his horse and rode toward Redemption Springs. He had avoided the mining towns since settling in the area, preferring solitude to the company of men seeking their fortunes in the earth. Redemption Springs came into view after an hour's ride, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a fast-moving creek where gold had been discovered 3 years earlier. The newly constructed railroad gleamed in the morning sun, a testament to the town's growing importance and the wealth flowing from its mines. Matthew rode slowly down the main street, taking in the details with the practiced eye of a man who had once made his living noticing what others missed. The town was more developed than he had expected. A bank, a hotel, a telegraph office, and several saloons competed for space with the necessary businesses of a frontier community. As he passed the land office, Matthew noticed the sign, Hamilton Mining Company, Land Management Division. The building was larger and more ornate than its neighbors, with actual glass windows and a freshly painted exterior. He continued to the general store, where he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, leather, and the particular mustiness of dry goods kept too long on shelves. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with spectacles and a shock of white hair, engaged in conversation with a customer about the price of flour. When the customer left, Matthew approached, introducing himself as a blacksmith looking for work in the area. The storekeeper, Otis Wheeler, proved to be a font of information, particularly once Matthew purchased tobacco and offered to share a smoke on the store's front porch. "Blacksmith, eh?" Wheeler said, puffing contentedly. "Could use one around here. Last fellow moved on when the Hamiltons refused to pay him what they owed." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like these Hamiltons have quite a reach in town." Wheeler snorted. "Reach, mister? They are the town. Came in right after the first strike, bought up claims from miners who didn't know what they had. Now they own the mines, the bank, the hotel, even got the railroad to build that station over yonder instead of 5 miles south where it was supposed to go." The old man glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "Victor Hamilton's the brains. Cold as ice, that one. Brother Ethan does the dirty work. Together, they've squeezed out most independent miners and scared off the rest." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "I heard there's been some trouble with the Lakota." Wheeler's expression darkened. "That business with Chief Gray Wolf's daughter? Nasty business. Found her horse wandering back into town yesterday, blood on the saddle. Figured she was dead." "What was this about silver being stolen?" Matthew pressed. "Hamilton claims she took silver samples from their office. Valuable specimens, supposedly." Wheeler shook his head. "Never believed it myself. That girl was educated at the mission school. Smart as a whip and proud as they come. Wouldn't risk her people's safety for trinkets." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a wagon driven by a middle-aged black man. Wheeler nodded in greeting. "Morning, Samuel. Your usual supplies today?" The driver, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair at his temples, nodded. "Yes, sir, Mr. Wheeler. And some extra coffee if you've got it." Wheeler disappeared inside to gather the order, leaving Matthew and the newcomer alone on the porch. The man called Samuel gave Matthew an appraising look. "Haven't seen you around these parts before," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of the South. "Just passing through," Matthew replied. Matthew Callahan. Samuel Parker. The man offered his hand, which Matthew shook. I drive for the stage company, also do odd hauling jobs when needed. There was something in Parker's manner, a watchfulness, a careful measuring of words, that spoke to Matthew of a shared experience. The way he scanned the street as they talked, his positioning with his back to the wall, these were the habits of a man who had seen combat. You served? Matthew asked quietly. Parker's expression shifted slightly, surprise giving way to recognition of a fellow veteran. 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, colored troops. You? 12th New York, Gettysburg, among others. A moment of understanding passed between them, the unspoken bond of men who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and survived to carry the weight of those memories. Wheeler returned with Parker's supplies, and as the driver began loading his wagon, he paused beside Matthew. Word of advice, Mr. Callahan. Whatever brought you to Redemption Springs, consider moving on. This town has a way of bringing out the worst in men. Before Matthew could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. The bat-wing doors burst open as a man was roughly thrown onto the boardwalk, landing hard on his side. A taller figure followed, boot connecting solidly with the fallen man's ribs. Thieving dog, the attacker shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the street. You think I wouldn't notice? The man on the ground curled protectively around himself. Mr. Hamilton, I swear I wasn't stealing. That was my claim before you. Another kick silenced him. Your claim. Everything in that mine belongs to Hamilton Mining now. The gold, the equipment, even the air you breathe down there. Matthew studied the standing man with intense focus. Ethan Hamilton was perhaps 45, well-dressed, but with the muscled build of someone not afraid of physical labor. His face was flushed with anger or drink, possibly both. Should we do something? Matthew asked quietly. Parker shook his head. That's Ethan Hamilton. His brother Victor lets him handle the discipline. Last man who interfered ended up with a broken jaw and charges of assault. The beating continued, drawing a small crowd of onlookers who maintained a careful distance. Most watched impassively, some with discomfort, none with any apparent intention to intervene. Matthew had seen such scenes before, in Boston when dock workers were beaten for organizing, in army camps when officers abused their power, in southern towns during the war when freed slaves were terrorized for asserting their rights. Always there were witnesses. Always they looked away. He had promised himself a life of isolation, free from the conflicts of others. But as the miner cried out again, something inside Matthew shifted. Before he could reconsider, he was crossing the street, moving with the deliberate calm of a man who had faced greater dangers than an angry mine owner. That's enough, Matthew said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in battle. Ethan Hamilton turned, surprise momentarily replacing rage on his features. Who the hell are you? Someone who thinks you've made your point. Matthew stood relaxed but ready, eyes steady on Hamilton's face. The crowd had gone silent, the tableau frozen in the morning sun. The fallen miner, the furious Hamilton, and the stranger between them. Ethan assessed Matthew, taking in his weathered appearance, the way he carried himself, and perhaps most importantly, the revolver holstered at his hip. This is company business, Hamilton said, voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. I suggest you move along. Happy to, Matthew replied evenly, soon as you let this man get to a doctor. For a tense moment, it seemed Ethan might escalate the confrontation. Then, with a dismissive gesture, he stepped back. Take your sympathy elsewhere. Everyone in this town knows the rules. He turned to the gathered crowd, and everyone just got a reminder of what happens to thieves. The word struck Matthew like a physical blow, the image of Sarah's wounded body flashing through his mind. He maintained his composure with effort as Hamilton stalked back into the saloon. Matthew helped the injured miner to his feet. The man, perhaps 30 with the weathered look of someone who worked underground, leaned heavily against him. You shouldn't have done that, he whispered. They'll remember your face now. Let them, Matthew replied, guiding him toward what appeared to be the doctor's office. As they moved slowly down the boardwalk, Matthew felt eyes watching from the second floor of the hotel. Looking up, he caught a glimpse of an older man observing the scene through a window, gray-bearded, well-dressed, with the cold calculation of a predator studying potential prey. Victor Hamilton, Matthew was certain, the man who might hold the answers he had sought for 7 long years. By the time Matthew returned to his ranch, the sun was low in the western sky, painting the mountains with gold and crimson. He had spent the day gathering information, building a picture of Redemption Springs and the men who controlled it. What he learned confirmed his suspicions. The Hamiltons had appeared in the territory shortly after the first gold strikes, with capital from unknown sources and connections in territorial government that smoothed their path to ownership. Their rise to power had been accompanied by a series of convenient accidents befalling those who opposed them. Cave-ins that killed independent miners, fires that destroyed competing businesses, witnesses who disappeared before testifying. Most troubling was what he learned about their treatment of the Lakota. Chief Grey Wolf had initially negotiated a treaty allowing mining in exchange for protection of sacred lands and a percentage of profits to benefit his people. The treaty had been registered with both territorial authorities and federal Indian agents, until the documentation mysteriously vanished during a fire at the land office 6 months ago. Without proof of their rights, the Lakota were now being systematically pushed from their lands, labeled as squatters and thieves on property the Hamiltons claimed to own outright. As Matthew approached his cabin, he noticed something was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, lantern light spilling out into the gathering dusk. He dismounted quietly, drawing his revolver and approaching with caution. Voices drifted from within, Sarah's, tense but controlled, and several male voices he didn't recognize. Moving silently to the window, Matthew peered inside to assess the situation. Sarah was on her feet, remarkably recovered considering her condition the previous day. She held Matthew's spare revolver with the confidence of someone familiar with firearms. Facing her were 5 men, their backs to the window. At their heads stood a figure Matthew recognized immediately from Wheeler's description, Victor Hamilton himself. "The girl comes with us, one way or another," Hamilton was saying, his voice cultured but hard. "The sheriff has a warrant for her arrest on charges of theft and assault." "Your sheriff is paid from your pocket," Sarah replied steadily, "and we both know what happened to the last Lakota taken into custody." Hamilton smiled without warmth. "That unfortunate incident was the work of overzealous deputies. I personally guarantee your safety. Like you guaranteed the safety of our treaty, the one your brother burned after murdering my father." The accusation hung in the air, met with a dismissive wave from Hamilton. "Colorful allegations from a desperate thief. Now enough talk, you're coming with us." One of Hamilton's men moved forward, reaching for Sarah. Matthew had seen enough. He stepped through the doorway, revolver aimed at the center of the group. "Gentlemen," he said coolly, "you're trespassing on private property." The men spun around, hands moving to their weapons. Hamilton raised a hand, stopping them as he studied Matthew with interest. "Mr. Callahan, I presume? I heard about your intervention in town today." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're harboring a fugitive, sir. This woman is wanted by territorial authorities." "Funny coincidence," Matthew replied. "Just yesterday I found her strung up between 2 posts, left to die. Would territorial authorities know anything about that?" Hamilton's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, annoyance perhaps, or calculation. "Regrettable if true, frontier justice can be crude, all the more reason to establish proper legal proceedings." He gestured to Sarah. "The young lady faces serious charges. She'll receive a fair trial." "Like her father did?" Matthew kept his tone even, but his grip on the revolver never wavered. A tense silence filled the cabin. Hamilton's men shifted uncomfortably, clearly expecting a simple retrieval mission rather than armed resistance. Matthew noticed something then, as Hamilton's right hand moved subtly toward his coat, the sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a distinctive scar across his wrist. A thin, precise line, exactly like the wound Matthew had inflicted on one of his family's attackers during their final desperate struggle. The sight sent ice through Matthew's veins, but he maintained his composure, mind racing. After 7 years of searching, could fate have delivered his family's killer to his very doorstep? "I practiced law in Boston before the war, Mr. Hamilton," Matthew said conversationally. though his eyes never left the scar. I still remember enough to know that entering a private dwelling without a warrant is illegal, even in the territories. Hamilton's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Boston? Interesting coincidence. I had business interests there many years ago. Small world, Matthew replied. The two men locked eyes, each recognizing the subtle probing beneath the civil words. After a moment, Hamilton adjusted his coat and gestured to his men. We'll withdraw for now, out of respect for property rights. But this matter isn't concluded. He fixed Matthew with a hard stare. Consider carefully whose side you're taking, Mr. Callahan. Redemption Springs rewards its friends and punishes its enemies. We'll return with proper documentation. I'll be here, Matthew answered simply. As the men filed out, Hamilton paused in the doorway. By the way, I admire your craftsmanship. Not many blacksmiths in these parts have such skillful hands. The implied threat hung in the air as Hamilton departed. Matthew watched through the window as the group mounted their horses and rode away, their forms gradually swallowed by the gathering darkness. When they were gone, Sarah lowered the revolver, her hand trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. They will return, she said, with more men. Matthew nodded, securing the door and checking the windows. I know. Why did you help me? Her question was direct, her dark eyes searching his face. You risk everything for a stranger. Matthew considered his words carefully. Let's just say I recognize something in Hamilton. Something I've been looking for a long time. He described the scar he had seen, its significance, and his suspicions about the connection between the Hamiltons and his family's murder. Sarah listened intently, understanding dawning in her eyes. So our enemies are the same, she said finally. My father always said true allies are found through shared suffering, not shared blood. They sat in silence as night fully claimed the land, the distant howl of a coyote emphasizing their isolation. There is more you should know, Sarah said eventually. The treaty my father signed, a copy still exists. The original was registered with your government in duplicate. My father kept one copy hidden. Matthew looked up sharply. Where? In the land office safe. Hamilton doesn't know it's there. My father hid it behind another document the day he registered it, suspecting treachery even then. If we could get that copy, we could pre-empt our rights to the land, Sarah finished, and perhaps find evidence of other crimes. The plan began to form between them, tentative at first, then with growing conviction. They would need to enter the land office, recover the hidden treaty, and somehow get the evidence to federal authorities beyond Hamilton's influence. A soft sound at the window interrupted their plotting. Matthew drew his gun again, moving silently to investigate. When he pulled back the curtain, he found himself staring into the face of a stranger, Samuel Parker, the wagon driver from town. Evening, Captain Callahan, Parker said quietly. Mind if I come in? I believe we have matters to discuss. The night had brought unexpected dangers, but perhaps it had also delivered their first ally in the coming storm. Samuel Parker entered the cabin with the cautious movements of a man accustomed to hostile territory. His eyes quickly assessed the space, noting exits and potential cover, habits Matthew recognized from his own military days. Forgive the late hour, Samuel said, removing his hat, but after what happened in town today, I figured Mr. Hamilton would pay you a visit. Matthew gestured for him to sit, keeping his revolver visible but no longer aimed. How did you find me? Followed Hamilton and his men at a distance. Samuel nodded towards Sarah. Glad to see you alive, Miss Blackfeather. Word in town was that you were dead. Sarah studied him warily. You know me? Knew your father. A shadow passed across Samuel's weathered face. I was there the day they killed him. The revelation hung in the air. Matthew poured 3 cups of coffee, the domestic gesture at odds with the tension in the room. As they gathered around the table, Samuel Parker shared his story. He had come west after the war, using his savings to purchase a wagon and team. As one of the few black businessmen in the territory, he had learned to observe carefully and speak seldom. His position as a driver gave him access to conversations and information that flowed through the Redemption Springs. I was delivering supplies to the Lakota camp that day, Samuel continued. Chief Gray Wolf had just returned from filing the treaty in town. He showed me the documents, proud that he'd secured his people's future. Samuel's hands tightened around his coffee cup. The Hamiltons arrived an hour later with 6 men. They demanded access to sacred land where their surveyors had found a rich gold vein. When the chief refused, showing them the treaty, Victor just laughed. He looked directly at Sarah. Your father was shot while reaching for the documents. They made it look like he was going for a weapon. Sarah's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her cup. I tried to testify to what I saw, Samuel continued, but Judge Harmon dismissed my account, said a colored man's word wasn't enough against respected businessmen. And no one else came forward? Matthew asked. Samuel shook his head. The other witnesses were Lakota. Their testimony wasn't even allowed in court. Why risk helping us now? Sarah's question was direct, her gaze unflinching. Samuel met her eyes. Because I'm tired of watching good people die while evil prospers. Because your father treated me with respect when few others did. He turned to Matthew. And because any man willing to stand up to Ethan Hamilton in broad daylight might just be crazy enough to make a difference. The three unlikely allies talked late into the night, sharing information and forming a tentative plan. Samuel knew the layout of the land office, having delivered furniture there when it was built. Sarah described the hidden compartment where her father had concealed the treaty copy. Matthew contributed his legal knowledge and tactical experience. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft noise outside. Not horses or men, but something lighter, more hesitant. Matthew signaled for silence, drawing his revolver as he approached the window. In the moonlight, he caught movement near the woodpile. Motioning for the others to cover him, Matthew slipped outside through the back door, circling silently until he was behind the intruder. The figure was small, crouched low, clearly trying to remain hidden while observing the cabin. With practiced efficiency, Matthew seized the eavesdropper, one hand covering their mouth to prevent an alarm. To his surprise, he found himself restraining not a man but a boy, perhaps 17, thin and struggling fiercely in his grasp. Easy, Matthew whispered, maintaining his hold. I'm not going to hurt you unless you give me reason. He dragged the youth inside, releasing him only after closing the door. The boy stumbled forward, regaining his balance and regarding them with a mixture of defiance and fear. Tommy Wells, Samuel said with surprise. What in God's name are you doing out here? The boy straightened, pushing back a lock of sandy hair. Followed you, Mr. Parker. Wanted to know what was so important you'd ride out after dark. Matthew studied the newcomer. Tommy wore the rough clothes of a laborer, but his speech suggested some education. His left eye was swollen, a recent bruise darkening his cheekbone. You work for Hamilton, Sarah said, her voice cold. I've seen you at this mining office. Tommy's gaze dropped. Yes, ma'am. I run errands, deliver messages. Spy on people, Matthew suggested. The boy flushed. Sometimes, but that's not why I'm here. He looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes. I was there when they brought you in. I heard what they did. It wasn't right. Sarah's expression remained skeptical. So now your conscience troubles you? They're planning something worse, Tommy blurted. For all the Lakota, I heard them talking. Mr. Victor said it's time to solve the Indian problem once and for all. The stark declaration silenced them. Matthew exchanged glances with Samuel, seeing his own concern reflected. How do we know this isn't a trap? Sarah demanded. That Hamilton didn't send you to learn our plans? Tommy pulled up his sleeve, revealing a pattern of old burns along his forearm. Mr. Ethan gave me these last year when I spilled ink on his ledger. Mr. Victor's worse. He doesn't leave marks where people can see them. He swallowed hard. They've put a price on your head, Miss Blackfeather. $500, and they know you're here now. His gaze shifted to Matthew. They're asking questions about you too, Mr. Callahan. Telegraphed east for information. Matthew absorbed this news calmly, though his mind raced with the implications. If the Hamiltons discovered his true identity and his former profession, they might make the connection to Boston. What do you want, Tommy? He asked directly. The boy straightened his shoulders. To help, I know the land office better than anyone. Know when the clerk leaves, where he keeps the keys. Know which floorboards creak and which windows don't latch proper. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You're offering to help us break in? I'm offering to help you get justice, Tommy corrected, a hint of steel entering his voice. My ma was half Cherokee. Died last winter when the doctor wouldn't treat her. Said Indians should go to their own medicine men. The personal revelation hung in the air, offering context for the boy's unexpected alliance. Matthew studied him carefully, weighing risk against potential benefit. "If you betray us," he said finally, "I want you to understand what's at stake. Not just our lives, but the lives of an entire community." Tommy nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir." As the night deepened, four conspirators gathered around Matthew's table, plotting justice in a land where law had become a weapon wielded by the powerful against the vulnerable. Dawn broke cold and clear the next morning. While Sarah rested, rebuilding her strength for the challenges ahead, Matthew led Tommy to his forge. The fire was already burning, tools laid out in precise order on the workbench. "Mr. Parker says you were an officer," Tommy said, watching as Matthew selected a length of iron. Matthew nodded, placing the metal in the glowing coals. "Union Army. Seems like another lifetime now." "My pa fought for the South," Tommy offered hesitantly. "Died at Shiloh." Matthew turned the iron in the fire, saying nothing. "Does that make us enemies?" the boy asked. Matthew looked up then, studying the youth's uncertain expression. "The war's over, Tommy. Men fought for different reasons. Some for slavery, some against it, some just because they were told to." He returned to his work. "Your father's choices aren't yours to bear." Relief crossed Tommy's features. He watched intently as Matthew shaped the glowing iron, hammering with precise strikes. "What are you making?" Matthew held up the cooling metal, now formed into a skeleton key. "Our way into the land office safe, based on your description." Tommy's eyes widened. "You can make a key just like that? Without the original?" "A skill I learned long before the war." Matthew examined his work critically. "In Boston, I specialized in property law. Had a client who was a locksmith. He taught me the principles in exchange for legal services." He set the key aside, selecting another piece of iron. "In my line of work, I found it useful to understand how things could be secured and unsecured." As the morning progressed, Matthew fashioned several variations of the key, accounting for potential differences between Tommy's description and reality. The boy proved an eager assistant, pumping the bellows and fetching tools as directed. Around midday, Samuel returned from town with supplies and news. The Hamiltons had indeed been asking questions about Matthew, though so far they had learned little beyond his arrival in the territory 3 years prior. "They've also posted men at the land office," Samuel reported. "2 guards at night instead of 1. Matthew nodded, unsurprised. "And the telegraph office?" "Watched as well. They're suspicious of any messages heading east." The additional security complicated their plan, but didn't render it impossible. As they refined their strategy, Sarah joined them, moving stiffly but with determination. Her recovery, though far from complete, had progressed remarkably. "My people heal quickly," she said, noting Matthew's concern, "and some wounds must be ignored until the battle is won." As afternoon waned, Matthew retrieved the wooden chest from beneath his bed. This time he removed not just his uniform, but also a small wooden box containing various tools, slender metal picks, tension wrenches, and other implements unfamiliar to Tommy. "Locksmith's tools," Matthew explained, "for when the key doesn't work." He laid his Navy Colt on the table alongside a second revolver, a Remington New Model Army. Both weapons were meticulously maintained, the blued steel gleaming in the late afternoon light. Sarah watched as Matthew checked each cylinder, his movements economical and practiced. "You have lived as a blacksmith, but you carry yourself as a warrior," she observed. Matthew loaded the Remington and offered it to her. "You know how to use this?" She took the weapon with familiar ease. "My father believed we should understand the white man's weapons as well as our own." "Good." Matthew turned to Tommy. "What about you?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Shot a squirrel once with Mr. Ethan's rifle. Didn't much care for it." Matthew nodded, unsurprised. "I'm not asking if you like guns, Tommy. I'm asking if you can use one if your life depends on it." I don't know, sir." Matthew led Tommy outside, setting up empty bottles on a fence post 30 yards away. He showed the boy how to hold the Colt, how to sight along the barrel, how to account for the weapon's kick. "The gun is a tool," Matthew explained as Tommy attempted his first shot, missing widely. "Like a hammer or a saw. Its purpose depends on the hand that holds it." He adjusted Tommy's stance, guiding him through the process again. "I'm not teaching you to kill. I'm teaching you to protect yourself and others who cannot protect themselves." Tommy's second shot shattered a bottle, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon. The boy lowered the gun, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. Sometimes, Matthew continued quietly, justice requires force. Not because violence is the answer, but because evil only respects what it fears. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, the four conspirators made final preparations. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. Samuel would drive his wagon into town as usual, with Sarah hidden beneath a false floor he had constructed. Matthew and Tommy would enter separately, meeting at the land office after midnight when the town quieted. If all went well, they would retrieve the hidden treaty, make copies, and deliver them to a sympathetic federal judge in Cheyenne via the morning stage, which Samuel would be driving. If things went poorly, each understood the risks they faced. As twilight deepened into night, Matthew found Sarah standing outside the cabin, gazing at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. "My father taught me their names," she said without turning. "He said the stars are ancestors watching over us, guiding our path when the way seems lost." Matthew stood beside her, following her gaze upward. "My wife Elizabeth used to say something similar, that those we've lost become part of the light that helps us find our way." Sarah glanced at him, this rare personal disclosure creating a momentary connection between them. "You still seek justice for them?" It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. "Every day. And if you find it, what then?" The question caught him off guard, not because he hadn't considered it, but because he had never shared those thoughts aloud. "Then I'll have kept my promise," he said finally. "Beyond that, I stopped planning for after a long time ago." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My people have a saying, when you ride to avenge, dig two graves." "Wise people," Matthew acknowledged. "Yes." Sarah's gaze returned to the stars. "But wisdom and survival are not always the same path." The philosophical exchange ended as Samuel approached, signaling it was time to depart. Their mission, born of separate tragedies but united in purpose, was about to begin. Redemption Springs transformed at night. The bustling mining town of daylight hours became a different creature after dark. Saloons overflowed with miners spending their earnings, piano music and raucous laughter spilling into the street alongside the occasional drunk or brawler. Matthew entered town on foot, having left his horse tethered a mile out. He wore nondescript clothing, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. Moving with purpose, but without haste, he blended with the evening foot traffic, just another prospector or drifter passing through. The land office sat at the eastern end of Main Street, a respectable distance from the saloons and gambling houses. Dark now, its windows reflected the occasional lamplight from passing pedestrians. According to Tommy, the clerk locked up at 6 each evening, with guards arriving at 8 for the night shift. The boy had identified a narrow alley behind the building where a window with a broken latch provided potential access. Matthew circled the block casually, noting the two guards at the front entrance. Burly men with shotguns propped beside them as they played cards at a small table. Neither appeared particularly vigilant, though both wore sidearms and carried the hard look of experienced fighters. Making his way around to the back alley, Matthew found Tommy already waiting in the shadows, nervousness evident in his restless shifting. "Any problems?" Matthew whispered, joining him in the darkness. Tommy shook his head. "No, sir, but there's something you should know. They've added a third guard inside. I saw him through the window earlier." This complication required adjustment, but didn't derail their plan. Matthew surveyed the rear of the building, identifying the window Tommy had described, a small opening at ground level that likely ventilated a storage room. "You're sure about the latch?" "Yes, sir. I've used it myself when Mr. Ethan locks me in for punishment. They never fixed it proper." The casual revelation of ongoing abuse strengthened Matthew's resolve. He squeezed Tommy's shoulder briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's resilience. "Wait for my signal," he instructed, then moved toward the window. The latch indeed proved faulty, allowing Matthew to ease the window open with minimal noise. He peered inside, confirming it led to a small storage room lined with shelves of document boxes and supplies. After ensuring the room was empty, Matthew signaled Tommy forward. The boy slipped through the window with practiced ease, Matthew following more carefully due to his larger frame. Inside, the land office smelled of paper, ink, and the particular mustiness of official documents stored too long without proper air. They paused in the storage room, listening for movement. Faint voices drifted from the front of the building. The guards outside, their conversation just audible through the walls. Tommy pointed to the door, then held up 3 fingers and gestured to indicate the location of the interior guard. Matthew nodded understanding. Moving silently to the door, he eased it open a fraction, peering through the crack. The main office beyond was dimly lit by a single lamp. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. The interior guard sat in a chair by the front door, head tilted back, soft snores indicating he had succumbed to the monotony of night duty. Matthew turned to Tommy, mouthing a question. "The safe?" The boy pointed to the far wall, where an iron safe stood partially hidden behind the clerk's desk. Matthew nodded and gestured for Tommy to wait while he dealt with the sleeping guard. Drawing his revolver as a precaution, Matthew slipped through the door and moved across the office with the silent precision of a predator. The guard never stirred as Matthew positioned himself behind him. With practiced efficiency, Matthew clamped one hand over the man's mouth while simultaneously pressing the revolver barrel to his temple. The guard jolted awake, eyes widening in terror. "Not a sound," Matthew whispered. "Nod if you understand." The guard nodded frantically. Matthew could feel the man's pulse racing beneath his fingers. "I have no quarrel with you personally," Matthew continued, voice low and calm, "but I will not hesitate if you force my hand. We're going to the storage room." Again, not a sound. He guided the terrified guard to the back room where Tommy waited with rope ready. Within minutes, they had the man bound and gagged, propped against the storage room wall. "He's seen our faces," Tommy whispered anxiously. "Can't be helped," Matthew replied. "We'll be long gone before he's found." Returning to the main office, Matthew approached the safe, examining it critically. The iron box was substantial but outdated, a model he recognized from his Boston days. Using the tools from his kit, he began the delicate process of manipulation while Tommy kept watch at the front window. The lock resisted initially, Matthew's fingers working patiently as he felt for the subtle vibrations that would indicate success. When the tumblers finally aligned with a satisfying click, he allowed himself a brief smile of satisfaction. "Got it," he murmured, easing the heavy door open. Inside, the safe contained several cash boxes, account ledgers, and stacks of official documents. Matthew began carefully searching through the papers, looking for the treaty Sarah had described. "Tommy," he called softly, "I need your eyes." Sarah said it would be behind another document, something about mining rights. The boy joined him, rifling through papers with nervous energy. After several tense minutes, he pulled out a folded document. Could this be it? It was stuck to the back of this survey map. Matthew examined the paper, excitement building as he recognized official treaty language. The document was indeed what they sought, a properly executed agreement between the federal government and the Lakota tribe, signed by Chief Gray Wolf and a territorial representative, with the official seal intact. "This is it," he confirmed. "Now we need to—" A sound from outside interrupted. Boots on the boardwalk, voices approaching. Tommy's eyes widened in alarm. "More guards," he whispered urgently. Matthew quickly folded the treaty, tucking it inside his shirt. "Get ready to run," he instructed, gathering their tools. The voices outside grew louder, stopping just outside the front door. Keys jangled. Someone was unlocking the entrance. "Back window," Matthew ordered, pushing Tommy toward the storage room. "Now." They slipped into the back room just as the front door opened, light from a lantern spilling into the main office. Through the partially open doorway, Matthew glimpsed 2 men entering. Neither was Hamilton, but both carried rifles and moved with purpose. "Check the safe," one instructed. "Mr. Victor says the combination might have been compromised." Matthew silently cursed their misfortune. The regular guard rotation wasn't due for hours. This was an unscheduled security check, perhaps prompted by Hamilton's growing paranoia. Their exit route now blocked by the tide guard, Matthew assessed their limited options. The window remained their only escape, but using it now would alert the newcomers immediately. Making a swift decision, Matthew removed a small flask from his pocket, coal oil for his lamp. He splashed some on a stack of papers, placed them near the bound guard, then struck a match. "What are you doing?" Tommy whispered in alarm. "Creating a diversion," Matthew replied, lighting the papers. They began to smoke immediately, flames licking upward. Matthew pushed Tommy toward the window. Go. Meet Samuel at the rendezvous. I'll be right behind you. The boy hesitated only briefly before squeezing through the opening. Matthew paused to ensure the guard, though frightened, was positioned safely away from the spreading fire, then followed Tommy outside. Behind them, shouts erupted as smoke filtered into the main office. The diversion would occupy the guards while potentially destroying any evidence of their intrusion, though Matthew harbored no illusions about who would be blamed for the fire. In the alley, Tommy was already running toward their agreed meeting point behind the livery stable. Matthew followed, staying in shadows whenever possible. They had barely reached the end of the alley when the night erupted in gunfire. A warning shot fired into the air, followed by shouts of "Fire!" and "Intruders!" The commotion spread rapidly through the town. Doors opened as curious residents emerged to investigate, further complicating their escape. Matthew and Tommy pressed themselves into a shadowed doorway as men ran past toward the growing commotion. We need to separate, Matthew decided. Less conspicuous alone. Meet at Samuel's wagon as planned. Tommy nodded, fear evident in his eyes but determination in his posture. Be careful, Mr. Callahan. You too, son, Matthew replied, surprised by the protectiveness he felt toward the boy. They parted ways, Tommy slipping between buildings while Matthew continued more openly, adopting the purposeful stride of someone responding to the emergency rather than fleeing from it. The strategy worked until he rounded the corner near the telegraph office. There, illuminated by the growing glow from the land office fire, stood Ethan Hamilton with 3 men, all armed and scanning the street. Matthew ducked back, but not quickly enough. A shout went up. There, by the alley! Abandoning stealth for speed, Matthew broke into a run as bullets splintered the wood beside him. He returned fire over his shoulder, not aiming to hit, but to discourage pursuit as he raced toward the edge of town. Rain had begun to fall, fat drops quickly becoming a downpour that turned the dirt street to mud. Matthew used the weather to his advantage, zigzagging between buildings where the poor visibility made him a difficult target. More shots rang out behind him, one close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. Matthew cut through the back of a half-constructed building, vaulted a low fence, and found himself behind the town's small church. There, hitched and waiting as arranged, was Samuel's wagon. The driver sat tensely on the bench, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Tommy was already aboard, huddled under a tarp. Where's Sarah? Matthew asked, as he swung himself into the wagon bed. Not here yet, Samuel replied grimly. Something must have gone wrong. Matthew's mind raced through possibilities. According to their plan, Sarah should have already transferred from her hiding place to the wagon during the confusion of the fire. A decision formed quickly. Get Tommy out of town. I'll find Sarah. Samuel shook his head. Too dangerous. The whole town's alert now. Which is why I need to find her before they do, Matthew insisted, checking his ammunition. Head for the creek crossing. I'll meet you there with Sarah. Before Samuel could object further, Matthew jumped from the wagon and disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness, the treaty secure against his chest. The land office was now fully engulfed, flames visible even through the downpour. A bucket line had formed, townsfolk working desperately to prevent the fire from spreading to adjacent buildings. Matthew circled widely, searching for any sign of Sarah while avoiding the growing crowd. She had planned to emerge from her hiding place in Samuel's delivery to the hotel and make her way to the wagon during the commotion they would create, a commotion now far larger than intended. A flash of movement caught Matthew's eye, a figure running between buildings, pursued by 2 others. Even at a distance, he recognized Sarah's distinctive movement. Without hesitation, he cut through an alleyway to intercept them. The pursuit led toward the livery stable at the edge of town. Matthew arrived just as Sarah ducked inside, her followers close behind. Drawing his revolver, he followed, entering the dimly lit stable from the side door. Inside, the smell of hay and horses filled the air. Lanterns hung from posts, casting long shadows between the stalls. Matthew moved silently, listening for movement. A scuffle sounded from the back of the stable. Rounding a corner, he found Sarah cornered by 2 men. Not Hamilton's regular guards, but local roughnecks, likely drawn by the bounty on her head. Nowhere to run now, Indian, one growled, advancing with a knife drawn. Hamilton pays the same whether you're alive or dead. Sarah stood her ground, a pitchfork held defensively before her. Her eyes blazed with defiance despite the clear danger. Matthew aimed carefully. I suggest you reconsider, he called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The men turned, startled by the intervention. Recognition dawned on the face of the knife wielder. You're that blacksmith, the one who stood up to Mr. Ethan. I'm the man who's giving you a chance to walk away, Matthew replied evenly. More than you were offering the lady. The second man, younger and visibly nervous, tugged at his companion's arm. Come on, Frank. Ain't worth dying over Hamilton's money. Frank hesitated, assessing Matthew's unwavering aim and composed stance. Something in that steady gaze must have communicated the certainty of his fate if he chose poorly. Your lucky day, Indian, he spat finally, lowering his knife. Next time you won't have your protector around. Matthew kept his revolver trained on them as they backed away, exiting through the main doors into the rainy night. Once they were gone, Sarah lowered the pitchfork, though her posture remained vigilant. You have it? She asked, eyes fixing on the slight bulge in Matthew's shirt. He nodded, patting the hidden document. We need to move. The whole town's searching now. Together they slipped out the back of the livery, staying close to buildings where the overhanging roofs provided some shelter from the relentless rain. The fire's glow behind them illuminated portions of the street, forcing them to choose their path carefully to avoid being silhouetted. They had nearly reached the edge of town when a voice called out behind them. Hold there! They turned to find a solitary figure approaching through the rain, revolver drawn. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the face of Ethan Hamilton, water streaming from his hat brim as he advanced. Thought you could burn down our office and escape, did you? He snarled, leveling his weapon at Matthew. Where's the boy? Tommy Wells. He was seen with you. Safe from you, Matthew replied, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah, as he should have been all along. Ethan's face contorted with rage. Thieving little half-breed. When I find him, he'll wish he'd never been born. His gaze shifted to Sarah. Just like your father wished before I put a bullet in him. The admission of murder hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Sarah tensed beside Matthew, her breath catching. It's over, Hamilton, Matthew said calmly. We have the treaty, the real one, with federal seals intact. By morning, it'll be in the hands of the territorial judge in Cheyenne. Uncertainty flickered across Ethan's features, quickly replaced by renewed anger. You're bluffing. That treaty burned months ago. Your brother's more thorough than you, Matthew replied. He kept the original, probably as insurance against partners like you who talk too much. The psychological warfare worked. Ethan's aim wavered slightly as doubt crept in. In that moment of hesitation, Matthew acted, lunging forward with the speed and precision of his military training. The two men collided, Ethan's revolver discharging harmlessly into the mud as Matthew knocked his arm aside. They grappled in the rain, boots slipping in the muck as each fought for control. Ethan was younger and fueled by rage, but Matthew had experience and technique. He methodically worked for position, using Ethan's aggression against him, waiting for the opening he needed. It came when Ethan overextended on a wild punch. Matthew sidestepped, catching the younger Hamilton's arm and using his momentum to drive him face first into a hitching post. The impact was decisive. Ethan crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Matthew quickly secured Ethan's weapons, then turned to Sarah. We need to move. That shot will bring others. Indeed, shouts were already sounding from the direction of the fire, people responding to the gunfire. Without further discussion, they ran for the edge of town, the rain concealing their escape into the darkness beyond. The downpour had transformed the creek at their rendezvous point into a swollen, angry torrent. Samuel's wagon waited on the near bank, the horses stamping nervously at the rising water. Tommy stood beside them, his face lighting with relief as Matthew and Sarah emerged from the darkness. Thought you weren't coming, the boy said, helping Sarah into the wagon. Had some persuading to do, Matthew replied, glancing back toward town where lanterns could be seen moving in their direction. We need to cross now, before they organize a proper search. Samuel assessed the rising creek with concern. Water's high, might sweep the wagon. No choice, Matthew insisted. They'll have riders out soon, checking all the roads. With grim determination, Samuel guided the team into the swollen creek. The horses balked initially, then moved forward, water soon reaching their chests as they fought the current. Halfway across, disaster struck. A fallen tree carried downstream by the flood collided with the wagon, nearly capsizing it. The impact threw Sarah against the side, reopening her wounds. Tommy barely managed to grab her before she could be swept away. "Hold on!" Samuel shouted, fighting to control the panicking horses. Matthew leapt into the water, knife drawn, and hacked at the harness of the horse most entangled with the debris. Freed, the animal swam for the far shore, allowing Samuel to focus on guiding the remaining horse and the damaged wagon. Through skill and desperate effort, they reached the opposite bank, the wagon barely intact. Matthew helped Sarah down, alarmed by the fresh blood staining her clothing. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her pallor suggested otherwise. "We need shelter," Matthew decided, surveying their options in the stormy darkness. "Somewhere to regroup." Tommy spoke up unexpectedly. "I know a place, old trapper's cabin about 2 miles upriver. Mr. Ethan took me hunting once." With no better options, they gathered what supplies they could salvage and abandoned the damaged wagon. Samuel led the remaining horse, which now carried Sarah, while Matthew and Tommy scouted ahead, alert for pursuers. The trapper's cabin proved to be little more than a dilapidated shack, its roof partially collapsed and one wall leaning precariously. Still, it offered some shelter from the relentless rain and concealment from searching eyes. Inside, Matthew examined Sarah's reopened wounds by the light of a small fire Tommy coaxed to life in the ruined hearth. The injuries weren't life-threatening, but the blood loss concerned him. "You should have stayed hidden," he chided gently as he rebandaged her side. Sarah's eyes flashed despite her weakness. "My people's future was at stake. I would not hide while others fought our battle." Matthew recognized the conviction in her voice, the same unyielding principle that had driven him through years of searching for his family's killers. He nodded respect rather than arguing further. While Sarah rested, Matthew carefully removed the treaty from his shirt. The document had survived their escape mostly intact, though water stains marked its edges. By firelight, the four examined their prize. "It's all here," Samuel confirmed, reading through the carefully worded agreement. Land boundaries, mining rights, protected sacred grounds, even revenue sharing from the gold mines. Tommy stared at the paper with wonder. "This little thing is worth all that trouble?" "This little thing is the difference between justice and theft," Matthew explained, "between a people's survival and their destruction." They dried the document carefully, then Matthew made a thorough copy using the paper and ink Samuel had brought. By dawn, they had two versions, the original to be delivered to the federal judge in Cheyenne and a copy as insurance. As pale morning light filtered through the cabin's broken windows, the rain finally ceased. Matthew stepped outside to survey their surroundings. The storm had transformed the landscape, streams overflowing their banks and new ponds forming in low-lying areas. Such conditions would slow pursuers, but also complicated their own journey. Samuel joined him, coffee cup in hand. "What's our next move?" Matthew considered their options. "You and Tommy take the original treaty to Cheyenne. Sarah's in no condition to travel that far, and someone needs to stay with her." Samuel nodded agreement. "And the Hamiltons? They'll be searching, but they don't know about this cabin, and the rain will have washed away our tracks." The two men stood in silence, watching the sun struggle to break through lingering clouds. Finally, Samuel spoke the question that had been hovering between them. "That scar on Victor Hamilton's wrist, you're certain it matches the wound you gave your family's killer?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Then this isn't just about the treaty for you anymore. It's personal." "It's been personal for 7 years," Matthew replied quietly. "But the treaty comes first. Justice for Sarah's people takes priority over my vengeance." Samuel studied him carefully. "You sure about that? Vengeance has a way of clouding judgment." Before Matthew could respond, Tommy burst from the cabin, panic evident on his young face. "Riders coming! At least 6 of them!" Matthew and Samuel rushed to the ridgeline where Tommy had been keeping watch. In the valley below, horsemen were indeed approaching, not from the direction of town, but from the northeast, following the creek. "Hamilton's men?" Samuel asked, squinting against the morning light. Matthew studied the approaching group through a small spyglass from his pack. "No," he said with surprise. "They're Lakota." The riders advanced cautiously, clearly following a trail despite the rain's efforts to erase it. At their head rode an elderly man, his long white hair and dignified bearing marking him as a person of importance, even at a distance. "Medicine Hawk," Sarah said from behind them, having limped to the ridgeline despite her injuries. "The eldest of our council, my father's advisor." Matthew lowered the spyglass. Friend or foe to us? Sarah's expression was complex, relief mixed with uncertainty. Friend to me, to you, that remains to be seen. The arrival of the Lakota warriors transformed their situation entirely. Medicine Hawk, a dignified elder whose face carried the deep lines of 8 decades of life, greeted Sarah with evident relief. Their conversation in the Lakota language was brief but emotional, the old man's weathered hands gently examining her injuries. When Sarah introduced Matthew and the others, Medicine Hawk studied each of them intently, his dark eyes missing nothing. Though he spoke little English, his nephew Two Bears translated his words. My uncle says you have shown great courage helping walking deer, Two Bears explained, using Sarah's Lakota name. But he must know your true purpose. Matthew decided that complete honesty offered their best chance. He produced the treaty copy, explaining their mission to secure justice for the Lakota and expose the Hamiltons' crimes. When Two Bears translated this, Medicine Hawk's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps hope, perhaps skepticism born of too many broken promises. Why does a white man risk his life for Lakota justice? Came the elder's question through his nephew. Matthew hesitated, then revealed his personal connection. His suspicion that Victor Hamilton was responsible for his family's murder years before. The admission seemed to satisfy Medicine Hawk, who nodded slowly. My uncle says shared enemies make stronger allies than shared blood, Two Bears translated. He asks if you will come to our camp. It is hidden in the sacred canyon, away from the miners' paths. You will be safe there while walking deer heals. The invitation represented both opportunity and risk. Accepting would delay Matthew's pursuit of Victor Hamilton, but it would ensure Sarah's safety and potentially gain them valuable allies. Before he could respond, distant gunshots echoed across the valley. 3 in rapid succession, then 2 more to sun. The Lakota warriors tensed, hands moving to weapons. Two Bears conferred briefly with Medicine Hawk, then announced grimly, Hamilton's men attack our people at the river crossing. They seek revenge for the fire. Sarah straightened, despite her wounds. We must help them. Matthew exchanged glances with Samuel and Tommy. The responsible course would be continuing toward Cheyenne with the treaty, securing legal victory rather than risking everything in a skirmish. Yet the sounds of conflict continuing in the distance made such cold calculation difficult to stomach. These were Sarah's people, suffering because of actions undertaken on their behalf. Samuel, Matthew decided, take Tommy and the original treaty to Cheyenne as planned. Sarah will go with her people where she can heal safely. And you? Samuel asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Matthew checked his revolver methodically. I'm going to introduce myself properly to Victor Hamilton. The decision made, they parted ways, Samuel and Tommy heading south toward Cheyenne with their precious document, while Matthew joined the Lakota riders racing toward the conflict at the river crossing. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the crossing, Matthew witnessed the brutality of frontier justice firsthand. A Lakota family, 2 men, 3 women, and several children, were pinned down behind rocks at the river's edge. Across from them, a dozen men led by Victor Hamilton himself fired from cover, their superior weapons giving them a decisive advantage. They were traveling to the agency for supplies, Two Bears explained, anger evident in his voice. Innocent people caught in Hamilton's revenge. Matthew surveyed the situation with a tactician's eye. The Lakota were outnumbered and outgunned, with the women and children preventing any retreat across the exposed riverbed. We need to split their attention, he told Medicine Hawk through Two Bears. Create a diversion so the family can escape. When the plan was translated, the old man nodded approval, dispatching warriors to positions along the ridgeline. Matthew found himself paired with Two Bears, working their way down through scrub brush to approach Hamilton's men from behind. The first shot of their counterattack came from Medicine Hawk himself, a rifle round that struck uncomfortably close to Victor Hamilton's position. As Hamilton's men turned to face this new threat, Matthew and Two Bears opened fire from the opposite direction. Caught in the crossfire, several of Hamilton's men broke cover, making themselves vulnerable to the trapped Lakota family, who seized the opportunity to return fire. The battle shifted quickly. Hamilton's advantage evaporated as his forces scattered, confused by attacks from multiple directions. Matthew worked his way closer, driven by a singular purpose: to confront Victor Hamilton directly. He caught sight of his quarry directing men from behind a boulder. Even in the chaos of battle, Hamilton maintained the bearing of a businessman rather than a fighter, issuing commands but staying safely behind cover, leaving the dying to others. Matthew circled around, using the terrain to approach unseen. When he was within 20 yards, he deliberately fired a shot into the rock beside Hamilton, announcing his presence. Hamilton spun, revolver drawn but unsteady in his manicured hand. His eyes widened as Matthew emerged from cover, weapon trained unerringly on his chest. "Matthew Callahan," Hamilton said, recognition and calculation visible in his eyes. "You're proving quite an expensive nuisance." "Victor Hamilton," Matthew replied evenly. "Or should I call you by the name you used in Boston 7 years ago? Edward Prescott, wasn't it?" The name struck home. Hamilton's composure faltered momentarily. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Matthew advanced steadily. "The scar on your right wrist says otherwise. My wife Elizabeth gave you that when you murdered her and our daughter Hannah, right before you staged their bodies to send a message about interfering with your business." Understanding dawned in Hamilton's eyes. "The crusading lawyer," he said softly. "I remember now. You were investigating my shipping company's connection to the slave trade." The casual acknowledgement of such monstrous crimes nearly broke Matthew's control. His finger tightened on the trigger, years of grief and rage demanding release. Hamilton sensed his advantage. "Go ahead, counselor. Pull the trigger. Prove you're no better than those you judge." His smile was cold. "But know this, killing me won't bring them back. Nothing will." For a heartbeat that contained eternity, Matthew stood on the precipice of becoming the very thing he had hunted, a murderer justifying his actions through personal conviction. In that moment, Sarah's words from the previous night echoed in his mind. "When you ride to avenge, dig 2 graves." His aim never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. "You're right about one thing," Matthew said finally. "Nothing brings them back. But justice isn't just about the dead. It's about the living." He gestured with his free hand toward the river where the Lakota family was now safely retreating under cover from Medicine Hawk's warriors. "It's about them, and all the others you've stolen from, murdered and oppressed." Hamilton's expression hardened. "Spare me your moralizing. This is the frontier. The strong take what they want. Always have." "Not today," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "Today, the law takes what belongs to it. You." Around them, the fighting had largely ceased, Hamilton's men retreating or surrendering as Lakota warriors secured the area. 2 bears approached, rifle ready. "Medicine Hawk asks if you want this man's life," he translated for the elder, who watched from higher ground. Matthew held Hamilton's gaze for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I want his day in court. I want the world to see what he truly is before he hangs legally for his crimes." The answer seemed to please Medicine Hawk, who nodded approvingly. Hamilton, recognizing his position was untenable, slowly lowered his weapon. "You'll never make it to trial," he said quietly as 2 bears bound his wrists. "My connections reach further than you imagine. Judges, governors, senators, all have benefited from my enterprises." Matthew secured the binding, deliberately aggravating the old scar on Hamilton's wrist. "Perhaps, but your empire of dirt is crumbling, Hamilton. The treaty is beyond your reach now, on its way to federal authorities who can't be bought. Your brother is likely in custody already. And most importantly," he leaned closer, voice dropping to ensure only Hamilton could hear, "I've found you at last. Whatever happens next, you've lost the most valuable thing a predator possesses." "And what's that?" Hamilton sneered. "Anonymity," Matthew answered simply. "Now everyone will know your name and your crimes. Nowhere left to hide." As they led the captive Hamilton back toward the Lakota camp, Matthew felt something shift within himself. Not the closure he had imagined finding for so many years, but something quieter and perhaps more valuable. A sense that justice, while imperfect, was still possible in this harsh land. Sarah met them at the camp's edge, her injuries tended by a Lakota healer. She watched silently as Hamilton was secured, her expression betraying nothing of her thoughts. "You didn't kill him," she observed when Matthew approached. "No," he agreed. "Some deaths serve no purpose beyond satisfying rage. His life is worth more as testimony." Sarah studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. "And your vengeance?" Is it satisfied? Matthew considered the question carefully. Not satisfied, he said finally. Transformed, perhaps, into something I can live with. Around them, the Lakota camp bustled with activity as warriors prepared for potential retaliation from the remaining Hamilton forces. Yet within this uncertainty, Matthew felt an unfamiliar sensation taking root, the first tenuous threads of belonging after years of deliberate isolation. Whether it would last beyond this moment of shared purpose remained to be seen. But as the sun reached its zenith above the hidden canyon, Matthew Callahan allowed himself to consider, for the first time in 7 years, the possibility of a future beyond revenge. As Matthew followed two bears through the narrow passage into the Lakota's hidden sanctuary, something shifted within him. He had fought alongside men of every background during the war, but never had he truly crossed the invisible boundary that separated the white man's world from that of the native peoples. The canyon opened before them like a revelation, not simply a hiding place, but a sacred space where earth, sky, and people existed in harmony unlike anything in the settlements. Stone sentinels rose on either side, ancient guardians shaped by millennia of patient wind and water. The air itself felt different here, cleaner, weighted with meaning. Children paused in their play to watch the strangers enter, their curious eyes lacking the fear or hostility Matthew had come to expect in such encounters. Elders sat in circles, their weathered faces maps of wisdom earned through generations of struggle and perseverance. In the center of it all, Medicine Hawk directed the placement of their prisoner with the quiet dignity of a man whose authority required no displays of force. Hamilton, despite his bound hands and the indignity of being led through the camp like a common criminal, maintained his arrogant bearing. Matthew observed how the businessman's eyes darted constantly, cataloging, calculating, searching for weakness, a predator even in captivity. He is dangerous even in captivity, Medicine Hawk observed through Two Bears' translation, like a snake that waits for your attention to wander. Matthew nodded agreement. He'll be waiting for his men to find us. They will not, Two Bears said confidently. This place is sacred, hidden, only Lakota know the path. Matthew wasn't so certain. Trackers could follow their trail despite precautions, and Hamilton commanded resources beyond mere manpower. Money to buy information, loyalty, even law itself. As evening approached, the camp gathered for council. Seated around a central fire with Medicine Hawk presiding, tribal elders discussed their situation while younger warriors contributed observations from perimeter patrols. Matthew and Sarah were included in the circle, a rare honor for outsiders. Through Two Bears' translation, Matthew learned that the treaty's significance extended beyond land rights. For the Lakota, the document represented recognition, acknowledgement that they were a sovereign people with inherent rights rather than obstacles to be removed for progress. My father believed cooperation possible, Sarah explained, her strength visibly returning after the healer's ministrations. Not submission, but partnership. The treaty balanced respect for sacred lands with allowing development elsewhere. The discussion continued as darkness fell, the firelight casting long shadows across faces both hopeful and skeptical. Some warriors advocated executing Hamilton immediately, arguing that white justice would never punish one of their own for crimes against Native peoples. Others, including Medicine Hawk, counseled patience, seeing the value in using Hamilton to validate their claims before territorial authorities. Throughout the debate, Matthew observed the dynamics of Lakota governance, the respect shown to elders, the space given for dissenting views, the absence of interruption when another spoke. It was a process both foreign to his experience and yet familiar in its purpose, finding wisdom through collective deliberation. When asked for his opinion, Matthew spoke carefully. Hamilton's crimes extend beyond your lands. In Boston many years ago, he murdered my family for threatening his business interests. In Wyoming, he's stolen from settlers and miners alike. His greed knows no boundaries of race. He paused, conscious of the weight of his next words. If we deliver him alive to federal authorities, along with evidence of all his crimes, we create the possibility for justice that transcends the usual divisions. Not white justice or Lakota justice, simply justice. Medicine Hawk listened impassively, his weathered face revealing nothing as Two Bears translated. When Matthew finished, the old man spoke at length in his native tongue, his voice carrying the quiet authority of decades. My uncle says your words have wisdom, Two Bears finally translated. He says when many rivers join, they become a force that even mountains cannot resist. Perhaps Lakota justice and white justice can flow together against this man. The council continued late into the night, ultimately deciding to hold Hamilton until word came from Samuel about the treaty's reception in Cheyenne. In the meantime, warriors would be dispatched to monitor Hamilton's remaining forces in Redemption Springs. As the meeting dispersed, Sarah approached Matthew where he stood gazing into the dying fire. You spoke well, she said. My father would have appreciated your vision of justice that crosses boundaries. Matthew nodded acknowledgement. Hamilton once told me that the frontier belongs to the strong who take what they want. I've seen too many accept that as natural law. And you? Sarah's eyes reflected the glowing embers. I believe strength without justice is just another form of weakness, Matthew replied. The truly strong protect rather than exploit. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion near the canyon entrance. Warriors were escorting a newcomer into camp. Tommy Wells, exhausted and mud-spattered, but apparently unharmed. Mr. Callahan, the boy called, spotting Matthew across the camp. Matthew hurried to meet him, concern evident. Tommy, what happened? Where's Samuel? Tommy caught his breath, accepting water from a Lakota woman. Ambushed 10 miles south of town, men waiting for us, not Hamilton's usual guards. Professionals. His voice trembled slightly. They shot Mr. Parker's horse from under him. He told me to run while he held them off. Cold dread settled in Matthew's stomach. The treaty? I have it. Tommy patted his mud-caked jacket. Mr. Parker made me take it before he started shooting. Said getting it to the judge was all that mattered. Matthew clasped the boy's shoulder, pride momentarily overshadowing concern. You did well, Tommy. Samuel would be proud. He's not. Tommy couldn't finish the question. I don't know, Matthew answered honestly, but Samuel Parker is a survivor. If anyone could escape, it's him. The news of Samuel's possible capture changed their calculations entirely. After consulting with Medicine Hawk, it was decided that Matthew would take the treaty to Cheyenne personally, accompanied by 2 bears and 3 warriors as protection. Tommy would remain in the camp with Sarah, safe from Hamilton's remaining forces. Before departing, Matthew visited Hamilton in his makeshift prison. The businessman sat cross-legged on a buffalo robe, his bearings suggesting he was a guest rather than captive. He looked up as Matthew entered, a thin smile crossing his features. Come to gloat, counselor? Or perhaps to beat a confession from me? Hamilton's voice carried its customary confidence. I'd have expected such barbarism from savages, but from a former officer of the court? Matthew remained standing, studying the man who had haunted his existence for 7 years. In the lamplight, Hamilton appeared older than he had in daylight, silver hair thinning, lines deep around his mouth and eyes. Not the mythic monster of Matthew's imagination, but a man, mortal and aging. Your men ambushed Samuel Parker on the road to Cheyenne, Matthew said. What were their orders? Hamilton's eyebrows rose slightly. My men? I've been your prisoner, Mr. Callahan. How could I possibly issue orders? You prepared contingencies, set pieces in motion before your capture. Matthew's voice remained level. Did you order them to kill or capture? A calculating look crossed Hamilton's features. Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that I employed certain professionals to secure documents stolen from my property. Their standard procedure would be to recover the items with minimal complications. Meaning anyone surrendering the documents would likely be left unharmed. Anyone resisting, Hamilton spread his bound hands, would experience appropriate consequences. The implication hung between them. Samuel's fate depended entirely on whether he had surrendered or fought. Parker's a former cavalryman, Matthew said. He doesn't surrender easily. Then I fear your friend has made an unfortunate choice. Hamilton's false sympathy couldn't mask the satisfaction in his eyes. Though I'm told the colored troops showed remarkable courage during the late war. Perhaps he died well. Matthew stepped closer, voice dropping. If Parker dies, I'll ensure you hang, not just for my family, but for every life you've taken or destroyed. I will dedicate whatever remains of my life to that purpose. For the first time, genuine emotion flickered across Hamilton's face. Not fear, but something closer to respect. You know, counselor, Under different circumstances, we might have been associates. You possess determination I find admirable. We are nothing alike. No, Hamilton leaned forward. We're both men who've sacrificed everything for a singular purpose. You call yours justice. I call mine progress. History will determine which of us was right. Matthew turned to leave, then paused. History is written by people, Hamilton, and people are beginning to tell different stories about men like you. Before dawn the next morning, Matthew departed with his Lakota escorts. The treaty, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was secured inside his shirt. Two Bears rode beside him, the warrior's keen eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of threat. Your friend Samuel, Two Bears said as they forded a shallow stream. He fought in the Great War? Matthew nodded. 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, colored troops, some of the bravest men I ever saw. Two Bears considered this. My father fought white soldiers at Greasy Grass, what you call Little Bighorn. He said courage knows no color. Only the heart matters in battle. Your father was wise. He died at Wounded Knee. Two Bear's expression remained stoic, but his voice tightened, shot while surrendering. The simple statement conveyed volumes about the chasm of experience between their peoples, a gulf Matthew had only begun to comprehend since meeting Sarah. I'm sorry, he offered, knowing the inadequacy of the words. Two Bears nodded acceptance. This treaty may not change the past, but perhaps it changes what comes next. They rode in silence after that, each man contemplating versions of justice that could never fully restore what had been lost. By midday, they reached the main road to Cheyenne, where they needed to decide, continue as a group, conspicuous but stronger, or separate to attract less attention. The decision was made for them when Two Bears spotted fresh tracks cutting across their path. Many horses, he observed, crouching to examine the disturbed earth. Perhaps 10 riders, heavily laden, traveling fast toward Redemption Springs. Matthew studied the tracks with growing concern. Hamilton's men returning to town, or something else? Two Bears pointed to distinctive marks in the dirt. Army horses, government issue. The implications were immediate. Either federal troops had been summoned in response to the land office fire, or, more hopefully, they had responded to the treaty evidence already reaching authorities. We need to split up, Matthew decided. You and your men circle north, avoid the roads. I'll continue to Cheyenne directly. Two Bears frowned. Dangerous alone. Less conspicuous, Matthew countered. And if these are federal troops responding to the treaty, I need to make contact immediately. Samuel's life may depend on it. The Lakota warrior recognized the logic but remained troubled. Medicine Hawk entrusted me with your safety. Tell Medicine Hawk I'm keeping my oath to see justice done. Matthew extended his hand, which Two Bears clasped in the white man's custom. Protect your people. I'll send word when I reach Cheyenne. With the decision made, they parted ways. The Lakota riders vanishing into the landscape with remarkable speed, while Matthew continued alone toward the territorial capital. The solitary journey gave Matthew time to contemplate what awaited. Best case, federal authorities had already received communications about the Hamilton case and were mobilizing to investigate. Worst case, Hamilton's political connections had turned the narrative against them, painting the land office fire as Native American terrorism rather than desperate justice-seeking. Reality, Matthew knew from long experience, typically fell somewhere between extremes. But Samuel's life and Sarah's people's future hung in the balance of which extreme the authorities might lean toward. He had ridden perhaps 2 hours when he spotted dust on the road ahead, a single rider approaching at speed. Matthew guided his horse into the cover of nearby cottonwoods, drawing his revolver as he waited to identify the newcomer. As the rider drew closer, Matthew tensed in recognition. Not one of Hamilton's men, but Tommy Wells, riding hard on a horse that appeared close to exhaustion. Matthew emerged from cover, startling the boy who nearly fell from his saddle, pulling up short. Mr. Callahan, Tommy gasped, relief washing over his dirt-streaked face. Tommy, what are you doing here? You're supposed to stay with Sarah. The boy dismounted shakily, his legs barely supporting him after hours of hard riding. Message from the camp, riders coming, Army scouts with a Lakota guide. Looking for you specifically. Matthew frowned. Federal troops? No, sir. Territorial militia. The guide told one of our hunters they're under orders from the governor himself. Something about arresting instigators of native uprising. The news confirmed Matthew's worst fears. Hamilton's political connections had framed the narrative, casting them as criminals rather than victims seeking justice. Did they find the camp? Tommy shook his head. Not yet, but they're following Two Bear's original trail. Medicine Hawk has moved everyone deeper into the mountains. But Hamilton, they couldn't take him along, Matthew finished grimly. Too dangerous with militia searching. Miss Sarah said you needed to know right away. Said plans had to change. Matthew considered their options, each more problematic than the last. The treaty needed to reach federal authorities, but now territorial militia stood between them and Cheyenne. Hamilton remained their most valuable evidence, yet transporting a prisoner made them more vulnerable. We need to find Samuel, he decided finally. He's the key. The militia will be looking for Lakota and for me, but a young white boy might pass unnoticed. Tommy straightened, understanding immediately. You want me to go to Cheyenne alone? With the treaty, Matthew confirmed. Find Judge Wallace Henley. He's an honest man from what Samuel said. Get the treaty directly into his hands. No intermediaries. Fear and determination warred on Tommy's young face. What about you? I'm going to find where they're holding Samuel. With Hamilton's confession and Samuel's testimony, we'll have enough to convince any honest court, if we can reach one. Matthew removed the treaty from his shirt, rewrapping it carefully before handing it to Tommy. This is your most important delivery, son. Lives depend on it. Tommy tucked the document securely inside his jacket. Where will I find you afterward? Redemption Springs, Matthew decided. Once the treaty reaches Judge Henley, he'll send federal marshals. Meet them there. They shared what remaining supplies Matthew carried, then parted ways. Tommy continuing south toward Cheyenne while Matthew turned back toward where Samuel had been ambushed. Tracking the ambush party proved challenging but not impossible. Matthew had learned woodcraft during the war, skills honed further during his years searching for his family's killers. The ambushers had made little effort to conceal their trail, confident in their numerical superiority. By late afternoon, Matthew found the site where Samuel had made his stand. The evidence told a clear story. Samuel's horse dead with multiple bullet wounds, spent cartridges from his Remington scattered in an arc, where he'd taken cover behind rocks, bloodstains suggesting at least one attacker had been hit. Most importantly, there was no sign of Samuel's body, meaning he'd either escaped or been taken alive. Matthew methodically followed the departing tracks. The ambushers had headed not toward Redemption Springs as expected, but east toward the old trading post at Fortification Creek. The choice of destinations suggested these weren't Hamilton's regular men, but hired guns operating with some independence. Night was falling as Matthew approached the trading post from the cover of a pine-covered ridge. The establishment sat alone on the prairie, a collection of log buildings surrounding a central courtyard. Originally built for the fur trade decades earlier, it now served travelers along the east-west trail. 4 horses stood in the corral while lamplight glowed from the main building's windows. Matthew tethered his horse in a sheltered draw, then made his way closer on foot, Winchester rifle in hand. From the cover of a wooden water trough, he observed the building's entrance. 2 men stood smoking outside, trail-hardened professionals by their appearance, with the distinctive bearing of hired guns. Their relaxed posture suggested they felt secure, unaware of pursuit. Matthew circled the building, seeking another vantage point. At the rear, a small window glowed with faint lamplight. Approaching cautiously, he peered inside and found what he sought. Samuel Parker, seated on a crude cot, his left arm bandaged but otherwise appearing unharmed. A single guard sat across from him, cleaning a revolver by lamplight. Relief at finding Samuel alive was tempered by the challenge of extracting him from 4 armed men. A direct assault would risk Samuel's life and likely fail against superior numbers. Matthew needed an alternative approach, or an ally. The opportunity presented itself in the form of a freight wagon arriving at the trading post, driven by an older man with a distinctly military bearing despite his civilian clothes. The newcomer exchanged greetings with the guards, then proceeded to unload supplies, apparently a regular delivery rather than a chance arrival. Matthew watched the interaction, an idea forming. When the freight driver returned to his wagon after completing his business, Matthew approached from the shadows. "Evening," he said softly, keeping his rifle visible but not aimed. "Mind if I ask what outfit you served with?" The driver tensed, hand moving toward his coat before recognizing the non-threatening approach. "Who's asking?" "Captain Matthew Callahan, 12th New York. And I need help rescuing another veteran being held inside." The directness seemed to catch the man off guard. He studied Matthew carefully. "10th Ohio Lieutenant James Cooper." "Infantry or cavalry?" "Infantry, Chickamauga through Atlanta." Matthew nodded. The specific battle knowledge suggested Cooper was genuine. "Those men inside are holding a former sergeant from the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. Colored troops, against his will." Cooper's expression shifted subtly. "Holding him why?" "Because he has evidence against a powerful man who's stolen land, murdered innocents, and corrupted territorial officials." The freight driver considered this, caution warring with evident curiosity. "That's quite a claim, Captain." "It's also the truth. The man they're holding fought honorably for the Union, while men like the ones inside were likely riding with bushwhackers or deserters." This struck a chord. Cooper's expression hardened. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A distraction," Matthew explained. "Nothing that risks your business or reputation. Just enough to draw attention while I get to the back room." Cooper deliberated only briefly before nodding. "I've got blasting powder in the wagon. Supposed to deliver it to the mines tomorrow. Small charge would make quite a show without causing real damage." "Perfect," Matthew agreed. 10 minutes to set up, then create your distraction at the front. I'll handle the rest." The improvised plan came together with the efficiency of men accustomed to battlefield adaptations. Cooper positioned his wagon near the trading post's front entrance, while Matthew circled to the rear. When the freight driver ignited his small powder charge, the resulting explosion sent the guards rushing forward to investigate the sudden fire that engulfed the wagon's empty bed. Matthew used the confusion to break through the back window, entering the room where Samuel was held. The guard inside had also been distracted by the commotion, allowing Matthew to disarm him before he could react. "About time you showed up," Samuel remarked dryly as Matthew cut his bonds. "Was beginning to think I'd have to escape myself." "Tried to give you the chance," Matthew replied, checking the bandaged arm. "How bad?" "Flesh wound. I've had worse shaving." Samuel retrieved his gun belt from a nearby table. "They were taking me to Hamilton's brother in Denver. Apparently, I'm valuable cargo." "You have no idea," Matthew confirmed, explaining the situation rapidly as they prepared to exit. "Tommy's taking the treaty to the federal judge. Sarah and the Lakota are in hiding. Hamilton's in custody, but territorial militia are involved now." Samuel absorbed this with the calm of a man accustomed to changing circumstances. "So we're fugitives from territorial law while being righteous in federal eyes. Typical frontier justice." Their escape through the rear window went uncontested, the guards still occupied with Cooper's diversion at the front. Matthew had positioned their horses nearby, allowing them to ride hard from the trading post before pursuit could be organized. "Your freight driver friend took quite a risk," Samuel observed, as they put distance between themselves and potential pursuers. "Not many would help strangers that way." "Not strangers," Matthew corrected. "Fellow soldiers. The war may be over, but some bonds remain." They rode through the night, making a cold camp before dawn in a sheltered ravine. While Samuel rested, Matthew kept watch, reflecting on the complex web of allies and enemies they had accumulated. Cooper's willing assistance demonstrated that justice could find champions in unexpected places, a counterpoint to Hamilton's corrupt influence. As daylight strengthened, they discussed their next move. Samuel argued for proceeding directly to Cheyenne to support Tommy, while Matthew advocated returning to Redemption Springs, where Hamilton was held. "The treaty is our best evidence," Samuel insisted. "We need to ensure it reaches the right hands." "Hamilton is our best witness," Matthew countered. "Without his testimony or confession, the treaty alone might not overcome his political connections." Their debate was interrupted by distant hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching at speed. Both men moved immediately to defensive positions, weapons ready. The riders emerged from the morning mist, Two Bears and his warriors, accompanied by Sarah Blackfeather herself. Relief was evident on their faces upon finding Matthew and Samuel alive. "The camp was discovered," Sarah explained after hasty greetings. "A militia scout followed tracks despite our precautions. We scattered to various shelters, but they captured Medicine Hawk and 3 elders." The news struck like a physical blow. And Hamilton? Two Bear's expression darkened. Freed. The militia commander knew him by name, called him Sir. Matthew absorbed this setback grimly. Their most valuable prisoner and witness was now free, likely already working to counter their efforts and consolidate his position. Their plans were upended the following morning when a lone rider approached their camp, not a Lakota scout or one of Hamilton's men, but a figure Matthew had never expected to encounter in Wyoming territory. The man dismounted wearily, his fine Eastern clothes travel-worn but unmistakably expensive. Despite never having met him, Matthew recognized Ethan Hamilton from Sarah's descriptions, Victor's younger brother. "Captain Callahan, I presume?" Ethan asked, remaining carefully beyond weapon range. "I've come a long way to find you." Matthew kept his revolver visible. "You're far from Denver, Mr. Hamilton. Last I heard, that's where you were based." "News travels." Ethan's eyes carried a haunted quality Matthew hadn't anticipated. "May we speak privately? I bring information about my brother that may change everything." After conferring with Samuel and Two Bears, Matthew agreed to hear the man out. They sat beneath a solitary pine, the mountains looming behind them like silent witnesses. "Victor has destroyed our family name," Ethan began without preamble. "I've spent years believing his lies, excusing his methods as necessary for progress." He removed a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. 3 months ago, I discovered these in a hidden safe at our Denver office. The documents inside painted a damning picture. Not only had Victor systematically defrauded the government and native tribes, but he had embezzled from his own family's businesses for decades, maintaining separate books and secret accounts. "He's been siphoning money since Boston," Ethan explained, a bitter edge to his voice. "Our father died believing himself financially ruined, suicide, though it was called an accident. Victor orchestrated everything, then positioned himself as the family's savior." Matthew studied the younger Hamilton, searching for deception. "Why come to me with this? Why now?" "Because despite what you may think, I have a conscience about it." Ethan's gaze dropped. "And because I received this 2 days ago." He handed Matthew a telegram. The message was brief but chilling. "Ethan, stop accident arranged for your return stop. Do not trust Bradford. Stop, destroy this Victor." "Bradford is Victor's man at the territorial office," Ethan explained. "My brother is planning to eliminate me, just as he's eliminated everyone else who threatened his empire." A grim smile touched his lips. "Including your family in Boston, Captain. I found records of that payment as well." The revelation, and the unexpected ally it brought, fundamentally altered their strategy. With Ethan Hamilton's testimony and documentation, the case against Victor became ironclad, potentially reaching beyond Wyoming to Boston and multiple states between. "What about Tommy?" Samuel asked. "Any word if he reached Cheyenne?" Sarah shook her head. "No news yet, but the roads are watched. Militia patrols at every crossing." Their situation had deteriorated significantly. With Hamilton free, Medicine Hawk captured, and Tommy's mission uncertain, their carefully constructed case was unraveling. "We need to regroup," Matthew decided. "Hamilton will return to Redemption Springs. It's his power base. That's where we'll find both him and Medicine Hawk." "Riding into Redemption Springs is suicide," Samuel objected. "Hamilton will have the entire town watching for us." "Not if we have federal authority with us." Matthew turned to Two Bears. "How fast can your best rider reach Fort Laramie?" 2 days, hard riding. "The fort commander is Colonel James Bradford," Matthew explained. "He served with me at Gettysburg. If your rider delivers a message explaining our situation, Bradford might intervene, especially with militia operating beyond their authority." The strategy was risky but offered their best chance of official support. While Two Bears dispatched a warrior to Fort Laramie, the rest of their group headed toward Redemption Springs, intending to observe from a distance until reinforcements arrived. They established a small camp in the foothills overlooking the town, close enough to monitor activity while remaining hidden from casual observation. Through Matthew's spyglass, they witnessed Hamilton's triumphant return, accompanied by territorial militia who now patrolled the streets openly. More disturbing was the sight of Medicine Hawk and the other Lakota elders being marched into the jailhouse, bound and under guard. "They're treating them as criminals," Sarah said bitterly. "Men who sought only to protect what was rightfully theirs." Matthew continued watching the town's activity. Hamilton's consolidating power, showing everyone who holds authority here. As night fell, lights blazed from the Hamilton residence on the hill above town, a celebration of sorts, with carriages arriving carrying well-dressed guests. Even from a distance, the display of confidence was unmistakable. "He thinks he's won," Samuel observed, "that we've been neutralized." "Confidence has always been Hamilton's weakness," Matthew replied. "He underestimates opponents because he believes wealth equals power." They were discussing potential approaches to the jail when a figure emerged from the darkness. Tommy Wells, exhausted but triumphant despite his bedraggled appearance. "Made it to Cheyenne," he reported after gulping water offered by Sarah. "Judge Henley received the treaty personally. He was furious. New Chief Grey Wolf apparently respected him." So hope surged at this first positive development. "What did he do?" Matthew asked. "Telegraphed the Department of Interior immediately. Showed me the response himself." Tommy's face broke into a tired smile. "Federal marshals are on their way, with arrest warrants for both Hamilton brothers." The news energized their small group. Federal authority would supersede territorial militia, particularly with documented evidence of land fraud and treaty violations. "How long until they arrive?" Samuel asked. Tommy's expression fell slightly. 3 days minimum. Judge said the nearest marshals are in Denver. 3 days while Medicine Hawk remained imprisoned. 3 days for Hamilton to potentially destroy evidence or spirit away witnesses. 3 days too many. "We can't wait," Sarah declared, voicing what they all felt. "My people are suffering now. Hamilton could order them transferred or worse." Matthew considered their limited options. "We need leverage. Something to keep Hamilton in check until federal authorities arrive." "Like what?" Samuel asked. Matthew's gaze fixed on the celebration continuing at the Hamilton residence. "Like the man himself." The audacity of the suggestion silenced them momentarily. Taking Hamilton hostage would be dangerous, potentially undermining their legal standing when marshals arrived. "We don't actually take him," Matthew clarified, seeing their concern. "We just make sure he knows we could. Remind him that his freedom and future remain precarious." The plan that emerged was both simple and extremely dangerous. While Sarah and Two Bears created a diversion at the jail, enough to occupy guards without actually attempting a rescue, Matthew and Samuel would infiltrate Hamilton's celebration to deliver a private message. "This isn't just about intimidation," Matthew explained as they prepared. "Hamilton needs to understand that his only path forward is cooperation. If he testifies against his associates and acknowledges his crimes, federal authorities might show leniency." "You believe he'll choose survival over pride?" Samuel seemed skeptical. "I believe Victor Hamilton's first loyalty has always been to himself," Matthew replied. "When cornered, men like him sacrifice others to save themselves." As midnight approached, they moved into position. Sarah and Two Bears led their small group toward the rear of the jail, while Matthew and Samuel approached the Hamilton residence from the garden side, dressed in clothing borrowed from Cooper, the freight driver, who had agreed to assist their cause. The celebration provided ideal cover. Servants moved throughout the house, guests wandered the gardens, and general revelry created constant motion that helped conceal their presence. Matthew identified Hamilton on the main terrace, holding court among sycophants and business associates. The mining magnate appeared completely at ease, confident in his restored position and apparent victory. Using the skills honed during years of tracking Hamilton, Matthew maneuvered through the garden until he reached a secluded corner of the terrace. When Hamilton excused himself from his guest to retrieve a cigar from his study, Matthew was waiting inside the darkened room. "Enjoying your celebration, Hamilton?" he asked softly as the businessman entered. Hamilton froze, hand instinctively moving toward a desk drawer before recognizing the futility. "Callahan, I must say your persistence is remarkable." "Not persistence. Promise, Wathu." Matthew remained in shadow, voice calm despite the danger of his position. "I told you I'd see justice done." Hamilton lit a lamp, illuminating the study but maintaining a careful distance from his uninvited guest. "And yet here I stand, free and respected, while your Native American friends await territorial justice in cells." He selected a cigar from a humidor, trimming it with practiced precision. "Your notion of justice seems rather ineffective." 3 days, Matthew replied. "Federal marshals arrive in 3 days with warrants for your arrest. The treaty has reached Judge Henley in Cheyenne. The Department of Interior has been notified of your fraud. For the first time, Hamilton's composure wavered slightly, a momentary stillness in his hands before he recovered. Claims require evidence. Evidence can disappear. Witnesses can recant. His smile returned. Even federal officials can be persuaded to see reason when properly compensated. Not this time. Matthew stepped forward into the lamplight. You've built your empire on the belief that everything and everyone has a price, but you've finally encountered something money can't buy. And what might that be? Memory, Matthew answered simply. My memory of my wife and daughter's faces as I found them. Sarah's memory of her father's murder. The Lakota's memory of their stolen lands. Samuel Parker's memory of your men's ambush. He moved closer, voice dropping. You can burn documents, bribe officials, threaten witnesses, but you cannot erase memory. And now those memories have become sworn testimony, documented evidence, official warrants. Hamilton's expression hardened, the lines in his 52-year-old face deepening with disdain. Touching sentiment, but ultimately irrelevant. This is the frontier, counselor. Might establishes right, regardless of paperwork or principles. Then consider this, Matthew continued. I entered your home undetected, past your guards, during your moment of triumph. I could end your life right now if justice demanded it. To emphasize his point, Matthew gestured slightly to where Samuel Parker stood in the doorway, revolver trained steadily on Hamilton. Instead, I'm offering you a choice. Cooperate with federal authorities. Testify against your associates. Return the Lakota lands. In exchange, you might avoid the gallows. Hamilton studied them both, calculating his options with the cold precision that had built his business empire. And if I refuse this generous offer? Then when marshals arrive, they'll find you facing every charge we can document, from land fraud to murder. Your name will join those historical figures remembered only for their crimes. The mining magnate took a long draw on his unlit cigar, then set it aside. You know, Callahan, in another life we might have been partners. You have the ruthlessness required for true success, however much you disguise it with moral rhetoric. Your answer? Hamilton smiled thinly. I'll consider your proposal. Now, unless you intend to murder me in my study, I suggest you depart. My guests will notice my extended absence shortly. It wasn't agreement, but it was acknowledgement of their strengthened position, perhaps the most they could hope for from a man like Hamilton. 3 days, Matthew reminded him. After that, events moved beyond anyone's control. They departed as they had come, undetected through the garden, while Hamilton returned to his guests, mask of confidence firmly in place, though perhaps less certain than before. At the agreed rendezvous point, they rejoined Sarah and Two Bears, whose diversion had successfully occupied the jail guards without casualties. Together, they withdrew to their hillside camp to wait for federal intervention. Will he cooperate? Sarah asked after hearing of their confrontation. He'll calculate his odds, Matthew replied. Hamilton's survival instinct exceeds his pride. The next 2 days passed with excruciating slowness. From their vantage point, they observed increased activity in town. More militia patrols, miners being questioned, Hamilton's men searching outlying areas. He's looking for us, Samuel observed, and probably for any evidence we might still possess. On the morning of the third day, dust on the eastern roads signaled approaching riders. Through the spyglass, Matthew confirmed their identity. 6 men wearing the unmistakable badges of U.S. Marshals, led by a figure he recognized from newspaper engravings as Chief Marshal Thomas Bennett. Their arrival in Redemption Springs created immediate tension. The territorial militia commander met them on Main Street, a confrontation visible even from the hillside camp. After several minutes of what appeared to be heated discussion, the militia began withdrawing from their positions around town. Hamilton's political protection is crumbling, Matthew observed with satisfaction. They watched as marshals entered Hamilton's residence, emerging an hour later with the mining magnate himself, now in handcuffs. Similar scenes played out across town as Hamilton's associates were systematically arrested. Most importantly, Medicine Hawk and the Lakota elders were released from jail, federal authorities superseding territorial detention orders. By late afternoon, Matthew judged it safe to approach the town. Their small group rode openly down Main Street, drawing stares but no interference from residents who sensed the shifting balance of power. At the newly established Marshal's headquarters in the hotel, they found Chief Marshal Bennett reviewing documents with Judge Henley himself, who had accompanied the federal force from Cheyenne. "Captain Callahan," the judge greeted them, rising from his chair. "Your young messenger was quite persuasive. The treaty document alone would have demanded investigation, but his account of your experiences convinced me of the urgency." The subsequent hours were consumed with formal statements, documentation of evidence, and legal proceedings that would form the backbone of the federal case against Hamilton and his network. The mining magnate himself remained silent throughout, maintaining his composure even in defeat. Only when Matthew passed him being transferred to a secure room did Hamilton speak privately. "I've made my decision, counselor," he said quietly. "Self-preservation, as you predicted." Matthew studied him carefully. "Meaning?" "Meaning I've provided Marshal Bennett with names, dates, and locations of every official I've bribed, every claim I've falsified, every competitor I've eliminated." Hamilton's smile was cold. "If I'm to face judgment, I'll have company in the dock." The systematic dismantling of Hamilton's empire continued for days. The treaty was formally reaffirmed, with Medicine Hawk signing on behalf of the Lakota. Land records were examined and corrected, with property returned to rightful owners, both native and settler alike. Hamilton and his key associates were transported to Denver for trial, their financial assets frozen pending legal proceedings. The territorial governor himself faced investigation for his role in dispatching militia against the Lakota. For Matthew, the resolution brought complexity rather than simple satisfaction. The justice he had sought for 7 years would come through courts rather than personal vengeance, a fitting outcome for a man who had once devoted his life to law before tragedy diverted his path. 1 week after the marshal's arrival, Matthew stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching Sarah and Two Bears prepare to depart for the Lakota settlement that was being reestablished on their rightful lands. "You could come with us," Sarah offered, her dark eyes studying him thoughtfully. "My people would welcome the man who helped restore their home." Matthew considered the invitation, touched by its sincerity. "I have testimony to give in Denver first. After that, I'm not sure what comes next." Sarah nodded, understanding. When a warrior completes his purpose, he must find a new path or wither like a plant without water. Wise observation. "Not mine, my father's." She mounted her horse with fluid grace. "He would have valued your friendship, Matthew Callahan." As Sarah and Two Bears rode toward their people's lands, Samuel Parker approached, his arm now healing well in a proper sling. "Judge Henley offered me a position," he mentioned casually, "deputy marshal for the Eastern Territory. Says they need men who understand both sides of the frontier." Matthew smiled. "You'll accept?" "Thinking on it, law enforcement's complicated for a man of my background." Samuel glanced toward town. "What about you, returning to Boston?" The question gave Matthew pause. He had never considered life beyond his search for justice. Boston held only memories of loss, while Wyoming had become something unexpected. If not home, then perhaps its possibility. "Tommy's staying," he said finally. "Marshal Bennett's arranged a proper apprenticeship with the blacksmith in town. Boy deserves a chance at a decent life." Samuel nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. "And someone to ensure he gets it." The conversation might have continued, but a rider approached from town, Judge Henley himself dismounting with the stiffness of an older man unaccustomed to horseback. "Captain Callahan," the judge greeted him, "I've come with a proposition." "I'm listening." Henley surveyed the modest ranch appreciatively. "The territorial court is being reorganized following Hamilton's exposure. We need men of principle, particularly those with legal training." He fixed Matthew with a direct gaze. "I understand you practiced law before the war." The unexpected offer momentarily silenced Matthew. His legal career felt like another lifetime, belonging to a different man, one who believed in systemic justice rather than personal vengeance. "That was many years ago, Your Honor. Yet those principles guided your actions here," Henley observed. "Not many would risk everything to secure justice for others." Matthew glanced toward the distant mountains where Sarah and Two Bears had disappeared. "I had help, considerable help." "All the more reason you are suited for this role," the judge continued. "You have demonstrated the ability to work across the divisions that typically separate justice in these territories." The prospect of returning to law, not as an avenger but as its administrator, stirred something long dormant in Matthew. The symmetry held undeniable appeal. His legal career had ended when justice failed his family. Perhaps it could resume now that justice had finally been served. "I'll consider it," he said finally. Judge Henley seemed satisfied with this non-committal response. "The position remains open until you decide. Redemption Springs needs rebuilding on firmer foundations than Hamilton provided." As the judge departed, Samuel clapped Matthew's shoulder gently. "Justice comes full circle, it seems." Matthew watched the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent behind distant peaks. For 7 years, that horizon had symbolized only the next step in his pursuit. Now it represented something different: possibility, renewal, perhaps even redemption. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, more to himself than to Samuel, "tomorrow I'll decide." But in his heart, Matthew Callahan already knew his answer. The path of vengeance had led not to an ending, but to a beginning. The protector's oath he had made at his family's grave had been fulfilled not through violence, but through justice. A distinction his younger self might not have appreciated, but his present self recognized as vital. 1 month after the federal marshals took Victor Hamilton to Denver, Matthew stood on the steps of the newly constructed courthouse in Redemption Springs. Judge Henley had been true to his word. The territorial court had been reorganized, with Matthew Callahan appointed as its First Circuit judge for the Eastern District. The weight of the gavel in his hand felt different from a revolver, a tool of creation rather than destruction. He'd taken the oath that morning, swearing to uphold justice for all people regardless of race or station, words he had once believed in completely, lost faith in, and now embraced again with the wisdom that came from both triumph and tragedy. "Looks good on you," Samuel Parker observed, adjusting his deputy marshal's badge. "Though I still can't believe you traded your forge for a courtroom." "Not traded," Matthew corrected. "The forge stays. Some lessons can only be taught through honest work." He glanced toward the smithy where Tommy Wells was stoking the fire, learning the craft that had sustained Matthew through his darkest years. Sarah approached, the silver in her dark hair catching the autumn sunlight. Their courtship had progressed with the deliberate care of two people who understood both loss and patience. Next spring they would marry, a union that many in town still whispered about, but one that symbolized the new order taking root in Redemption Springs. "Medicine Hawk sends a message," she said, her eyes warm with unspoken affection. "The first school for both Lakota and settler children opens next week. He asks if the judge might speak at the ceremony." Matthew nodded, feeling a sense of completion he had not expected to find in this life. "I would be honored." That evening, as they sat on the porch of what was now their home, Sarah watched Matthew finish a letter to Judge Henley detailing the Hamilton case's resolution. Victor Hamilton had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. His sentence, 20 years in federal prison, seemed both justice served and somehow insufficient for the lives he had destroyed. "Will you go to Boston to testify in the murder case?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Matthew replied. "Elizabeth and Hannah deserve their day in court, even after all these years." "And after, when all the trials are done and the past is finally laid to rest?" Matthew looked toward the mountains where the setting sun painted the peaks in gold and crimson. For 7 years, those mountains had marked the boundary of his self-imposed exile, a place to hide from the world and his own grief. Now they represented something else entirely, the beginning of a shared future. "Then we build something that lasts," he said simply, "something worthy of those who didn't live to see it." 20 years later, Matthew Callahan watched with quiet pride as his son James took the oath as a federal prosecutor in Denver. At 25, James possessed his father's sense of justice, tempered by his mother's compassion, qualities that would serve him well in a changing West. Tommy Wells, now sheriff of Redemption Springs, stood beside them at the ceremony. His path from orphan servant to respected lawman represented everything Matthew had hoped to accomplish when he first donned the judge's robes. "Your boy does you credit," Tommy said, as they shared a celebratory drink afterward. "Both of you." Sarah squeezed Matthew's hand, her eyes reflecting memories of their unlikely beginning amid violence and vengeance. "We did well," she agreed. "Better than either of us imagined possible when we first met." That night in their hotel room overlooking the city lights, Matthew reflected on the arc of his life, From promising young lawyer to grief-stricken avenger to instrument of true justice. The nightmares that had haunted him for so many years had finally faded, replaced by the peaceful sleep of a man who had kept his most important oath, not vengeance, but protection of those who needed it most. As he drifted towards sleep, Matthew Callahan understood that his life's true purpose had never been to punish the wicked, but to defend the innocent. A protector's oath fulfilled not through the barrel of a gun, but through the patient building of a more just world.